you're just joining on YouTube, welcome. We'll be starting in a minute. Hello, Nick Smith here, speaking to you from London. Welcome to number 25 in our series of Alpine ClubCasts. This evening, we're off to the wild west of Nepal in the company of Paul Ramsen, Rebecca Coles and Henry Edmundson. I really hope you enjoy it. The Alpine Club is in normal times an extremely active club for alpinists, and we're always looking for potential new members. We welcome both experienced members, alpinists, and those gathering their experience, who may be suited to aspirant membership. If you'd like more info on joining, then please get in touch with me. I run the Meets programme, and do have a look at our website. If you're watching an Alpine Clubcast for the first time today, then a special welcome to you. With us this week, we have members of the Rucksack Club, the Women's Alpine Adventure Club, and the Himalayan Club. It's great to have you all with us. If you're watching live on YouTube or Zoom, please add any questions for our speakers to the chat as we go along, and we'll try to get those answered at the end. And as usual, anyone in Zoom, you will be unmuted at the end for any applause, and do stick around for a chat. Henry Edmundson has explored, climbed and trekked for over 5 decades in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, Ladakh, the Indian Himalaya, Nepal, Bhutan and Tibet. He is the author of Tales from the Himalaya, a historical narrative of the whole Himalayan region. He's a member of the Alpine Club, the Himalayan Club, and a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Tonight, Henry's joining us from his home in Cambridge, and he's going to start by describing the beginnings of the trekking boom in Nepal in the 1960s and its main protagonists, Jimmy Roberts and Mike Cheney. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let me just share my screen. So good evening. The story of Western Nepal for me begins with this man, John Tyson, who was a fairly well-known post-war climber. He almost made the 53 Everest team. But he was the first guy to explore in West Nepal, entering the Api region on the Indian border with Bill Murray in 1953. And then he was a schoolmaster in days off or during his vacations. He managed to get to Nepal during the 60s, and he explored the Kanjaroba Massif, which is a significant mountain range in West Nepal, mapping it, finding his way into it and trying to climb it. And he was the guy that actually taught me my alpine climbing when I was a teenager, and a lot of my contemporaries as well. And he gave me an introduction to Kathmandu when I needed it. In 1969, I was working in the oil fields of Libya, and I had a month off to do something with. And I decided to fly to Kathmandu on my own and somehow go trekking or climbing or doing something. And Tyson gave me an introduction to these 2 guys, Jimmy Roberts and Mike Cheney, both Gurkha officers, ex-Gurkha officers. They settled in Kathmandu, and 4 years before I arrived, they'd started the first trekking agency in Nepal called Mountain Travel. So they'd figured out the basic format of trekking with the right tents, the right cook staff and so on. And they literally launched the trekking industry in Nepal, which of course provides a huge amount of income for the Nepalese today. And Jimmy Roberts was very, very kind to me. He lent me a tent. he introduced me to two Sherpas, Gurmi Dorje and Ang Pema, who had just come off Everest from a Japanese expedition. And most important, he gave me a map of the Annapurna and Dhaulagiri area. And this actually had been drawn up a year before by a famous Nepalese environmentalist. And in fact, he was a minister in the government called Harka Gurung, who was tragically killed in a helicopter crash in Kachinjunga a few years later. But Jimmy Roberts suggested a route for me, which was to start from Pokhara down here. By the way, the Annapurna range is here, Dhaulagiri is up here, this is the Kali Gandaki going up here to Mustang. And he said, head west to Dhaulagiri, which at that time was a royal hunting ground. And then he said, head northwards to a famous pass called the Jangla, which separates South Nepal from the Dolpo area to the north. And then try going up this little valley. I mean, he'd obviously seen it at some point in his travels. And if you have time, have the energy, try this little mountain here. It's about 19,000 feet high. And then having done that, why don't you come back along this old salt route that had become extinct since the Chinese took over Tibet to a small village called Gurchakani here, and then find your way back. And he said this traverse is quite tricky. It hasn't been done for years. And if you get to a particular river here, the Gustan Kola, and can't get across it, basically you have to retreat and find your way back exactly the way you came. So we set off, Ang Pema and Gurmi Dorje rushed into the Kathmandu Bazaar, bought a few pots and pans. I went to a bank and found some small denominations and put them in my rucksack. We jumped on the first DC-3 to Pokhara, which was the only way of getting there at that time. And you can see this was Pokhara in 1969. You see a genuine looking tourist there with a trilby hat and a airline bag. And we set off. And at Pokhara, we there's a refugee camp for Tibetans escaping the Chinese. And we picked up 3 porters. These two were a father and son team, Ergen and Zepten, who carried for us. And I'm very proud to say that when we finished our trek, they set up their own trekking agency. And I've tried to find them ever since, and I never managed to meet them again, but they were a great team. And then we had a third one, Ringzen, who you'll see later on. And our journey westward towards Dhulpatan went over this phenomenal pass called the Jalala, where you get amazing views of the Annapurna range, which you can see here. That's Gurmi Dorje on the right and Ang Pema on the left. And swinging the camera slightly to the left, you get this amazing view of Dhaulagiri and the beginnings of the Dhaulagiri range going off to the left. And so we continued, and really West Nepal is an amazing place because it's where there was a medieval empire, the Khasa Empire in medieval times, and the wood carvings, particularly on bridges, are quite phenomenal. And it's a really amazing place to visit, partly because there's very few trekkers or climbers go there even today. And we eventually reached the Jangla, which is this important col that separates the south of Nepal from Dolpo. And you can see this is looking east. You're basically looking at the Dhaulagiri chain. This is Putahian Chuli. This is Churan Himal. And I think the main Dhaulagiri summit is slightly hidden. And we descended to that valley that Jimmy Roberts told us to have a look at. This is the Seng Kola, and the mountain, the lower mountain on the left is the one he recommended us to have a shot at. But at this point, we realized that we'd made a serious miscalculation. Gurmi Dorje, Ang Pema, and myself had decided that, except for a huge chunk of yak meat that they threw into a plastic bag just before we started, we would live off the land. We would buy food as we went. And by the time we got to this point, we had no food left. The villages were extremely poor. The harvests had been very bad, and we simply couldn't find any food. So we made a deal with the 3 Tibetan porters to share their food with them. It was very, I mean, unless they had been willing to do that, we would have really been in real trouble. So we spent the second half of our month-long trek living off their food, which was basically sampa thrown into the back of the mouth, a sort of a cake that they made every morning, and tea. And we started the traverse to the old salt trading route to Gurjakhani by walking up to the col on the right here. And we started this week-long traverse of crossing all the valley systems leading south from the main Dhaulagiri range. And it was an amazing trip because we weren't sure if the map was good. And the Sherpas and I, in fact, did the whole thing twice, because each day we went up to the next col to have a look to see where we should be going the next day, to agree on where we should be going, and then descending back down to camp, and then repeating the whole thing the next day. And this went on for a week, and the scenario was truly dramatic. I mean, if we looked to the left, we saw the great chains of Dhaulagiri. That's Churan Himal. And while I was doing this, I was absolutely dreaming of coming back to this whole area one day and climbing one of these mountains. And I had my eye on either Putahianchuli or Churan Himal, which are the lesser Dhaulagiris. They're about 7,400 meters. Here are the porters. That's Ringzen in the middle. And the Sherpas like to have a fire every night because it was quite cold. It was October. And one of their real pastimes was actually setting light to the entire mountainside, which is why the scrubland behind them is actually already burnt. We'd burnt it on our sort of evening campfire. We got to the famous river that Jimmy Roberts told us about, and it wasn't actually that bad. We managed to ford it without too much problem, and passed over one more col, looking back to where we'd come over. And then we finally got, after a week, we got to Gurjakhani, and we walked into the village, and we saw the first chicken we saw. We bought it, we killed it, and we ate it within an hour. We were absolutely starving. And then from that point on, we just went back to Pokhara. 38 years later, I had the opportunity to actually climb one of those mountains I was gazing at in 1969. So we're now in autumn 2007. And if you look at that blue line, that's the approach from the west to Putahianchuli. So basically you fly into a really scary airstrip at Chufal, which is the airstrip for the administrative center of Dunai in Dolpo. And then you have a very pleasant walk in to the mountain. And this exact spot is famous for a serious, one of the most successful Mao insurgency attacks on the Nepalese government that took place. They came over the Jangla, which I showed you in the previous trek, and came down this valley and sacked the Dunai administrative center. Anyway, that was a few years before. We headed up the valley to Kakot, which is the last village before you head up the mountain to the right to the base camp for Putahianchuli. And actually, the climb up to the base camp was quite brutal. It was straight up the mountain, yaks to start with, and then from then on it was porterage. And we reached the base camp and had our first view of Putahianchuli. There it is. This is taken from near base camp. And it's not, as you can see, it's not a very demanding mountain. Actually, it's sort of a walk. But nevertheless, it took 3 camps to get up to the top. And but we were the only people there. And I think this is typical of West Nepal. I really encourage, West Nepal is rarely visited. And, to have a mountain of this size and the access isn't that difficult except for the approach to the base camp. It's a really great peak for, climbers such as myself, who aren't technically fantastic. So up we went. This is walking up to Camp 1. And I think this is either Camp 2 or Camp 3. That's Churan Himal at the back. And this is getting very near the top. Now we're looking at Churan Himal again to the east. And at this point, I was looking down into those clouds and remembering that 38 years before, I was, struggling through all those valleys and glacier basins with Gurmi Dorje and Angpama. And there we are on the top. I'm on the left there, and you can see Dhaulagiri peeking its way, the Dhaulagiri main summit peeking its way above An Pikao's head, An Pikao in the middle there. So that was a very successful trip. And it all started going wrong, actually, when we started going down, as is usually the case. So we got down to the base camp and packed up. We got the porters back to carry our stuff down. And then as we started down from base camp, this guy in the orange duvet simply collapsed. His name was Pierre. He was a doctor. And I remember sitting on a stone with him, with Georges, Chamonix guide, who was leading the expedition. We were just looking at Pierre, and we just realized he was just leaving us. And Georges suddenly got up and he slapped him over the face hard about 10 times in the hope that it would wake him up. And he did actually come to. And then it was a matter of guiding him down, really a very, very difficult descent into the valley. And you can see I'm holding him on the right. There's a guy holding him on the left. We have a fellow on a rope to make sure he doesn't fall face down on the mountain. And we finally got him down into the valley at midnight by torchlight. It was a real epic, I have to say. And the next day, he was well enough to be put on a horse, which was fairly important because he could just navigate the broad rivers because there was no way he was going to manage the path on the right. And so back to Kathmandu, the Pierre survived. And in Kathmandu, I decided to visit. I had it in mind for a while, but I'd never been there before. This is the British cemetery in Kathmandu. And you access it down a small road that goes between the British and the Indian embassies. And when you arrive, it's actually a very tranquil spot. And it's sort of like a typical English churchyard. Everybody's laid out nicely. And some of the legends of Kathmandu are here, including Boris Lisanovich and his family. He's the guy that opened the first hotel ever in Kathmandu called the Royal Hotel. Here I found Mike Cheney's grave, which I thought was really nice. I mean, it's not exactly a Christian grave, is it? Mike Cheney, this is how he likes to be remembered. And Jimmy Roberts died 10 years later. He was cremated and his ashes were thrown into the Setikola, which is the stream that drains Machapuchiri. Years later, I was writing a book about the Himalaya that I think Nick alluded to. And I came across this article in the Himalayan Journal by Jimmy Roberts describing the first ascent of Putahi Chuli, which he made with his Sherpa Angnima. And incredibly, I had no idea. He hadn't even told me when I went out in 1969, but he was the guy that made the first ascent. He discovered the way into the mountain and he made the first ascent. My acquaintance with West Nepal simply mushroomed after that. So this shows you two treks that I made with my wife, Connie, and friends, including Peter Dean, who I think is tuned in here. In 2013, we did a 7-week walk from Jumla through Upper Dolpog, skirting Kanjaroba, where Tyson had explored, almost to Kathmandu. And even more interesting, the next year, we went from Jumla to the Indian border, skirting under Api and Saipal. And this is an area where it's quite easy to come across villages which have never, ever seen a foreigner before. Just nobody ever goes to this area. And this is a shot, my last shot of, this is Connie and Pasang, 2 days short of the Indian border, looking at the combined massives of Api and Saipal. So for today's climbers, there has to be a huge amount of possibilities here. It's just a question of getting there. And those treks were just part of a larger chain of treks that we've been doing, traversing the entire Himalaya, my wife and I, and it's all written up in my book, Tales from the Himalaya. So I hope I've given you some flavor for West Nepal. It is a fabulous place. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Henry. A really interesting talk. Thank you so much. So next to speak tonight is Paul Ramsen. Paul's joining us from Leicestershire. He tells me that he lives the somewhat schizophrenic lifestyle of a mountaineer, funded by his work as a health and safety consultant. Since a sense of the classic Alpine North faces in his teens, he's continued to climb in most of the world's greater ranges. He's been a recipient of the PLA d'Or 4 times, and he says he puts his success down to a very tolerant wife and family. Tonight, Paul's taking us back to the far west of Nepal, to a previously unvisited valley, to an unclimbed mountain for which no pictures could be found and which wasn't on the permitted list. The only lead was a very large shadow cast on Google Earth, suggesting a very promising north face. His partner is Mick Fowler, and the year 2014. Over to you, Paul.
Hello there, everybody. I'm going to talk tonight about a trip I made in 2015 to a peak called Gav Ding. Okay. So I've been climbing with Mick Fowler for quite a number of years. I went back to university for to do a master's degree, and I missed out on a trip where he went to the Mughal region, and it was a bit annoying. I missed out on a really good trip, but since then I've sort of taken interest in West Nepal, and I've spent far too much time on Google Earth looking for nice climbing objectives in that area. While cruising along the sort of Nepalese Tibetan border, I came across this very striking shadow where a big peak created a really impressive shadow across the valley. The peak didn't appear to have any name, and we started a bit of research then. After looking into this quite a lot, it turned out that the valley was essentially unvisited. We couldn't find any pictures of the sort of north side of this mountain. Though we did find out that an Alpine Club member had led a trip to the south side of this peak, and that was Julian Freeman Atwood, and he named the peak, or given the peak the name Gav Ding. I think he got the name from just some local herders. So we kind of looked at this for a long time and just thought, it's a big chance, it's a big risk, but let's go for it. Let's go and climb this peak where we have no photos of it. We have no photos of the face. We don't know if it's climbable from the north. We don't even know if we can get into the valley. But let's give it a go. So we planned to go to Gav Ding. We had to do a bit of a jiggery-pokery to work out how to get a permit for the mountain, but we eventually solved that problem by a bit of creative thinking, which I'll explain in a short while. So the trip was on. Yeah, excellent. So just to explain where we're talking about, you've just seen Henry's amazing adventures crossing this whole region on a series of treks. Gav Ding is approached from a small town called Simikot. So we're talking the very far west of Nepal, and it's an area that's inaccessible by road. It's only accessible by aircraft, and it's you might imagine to kind of recreate Henry's adventures from the 60s. It's almost impossible these days, but that's not actually true. You know, West Nepal is genuinely unvisited. You know, there are places you can go in West Nepal where nobody has been. So it's, well, no sort of Westerners. So it's a place for genuine adventures that you can still have today. At the time, I was working 28-day rotations in Saudi Arabia. So to fit an expedition in was going to be quite challenging. So I kind of, usually I would sort of come home and get myself organised, but I realised the only way to fit this trip in was to actually go direct from Saudi Arabia to Kathmandu. I think that summer the temperature reached 57 degrees centigrade, and on the day I left Saudi Arabia, it was only about 43. So I jumped on the plane and then flew straight to Kathmandu. It was a bit stressful, to be honest, because I'd got an email the day before from Mick who said that there was a fuel embargo. Basically, India was blocking all fuel supplies to Nepal. So it looked like that even if we got to Nepal, there might be problems to actually fly into the mountain because there was a shortage of fuel throughout the whole country. And actually, this email was the start of a whole series of events, which it seemed like every day something was going to happen to stop us getting to the mountain. Which is kind of like most trips, really. When you go on an expedition, it's just an endless succession of things going wrong. And actually, I think the greatest achievement in any expedition is actually getting to base camp. Kind of climbing the mountain is a bit secondary. I think getting to base camp is one of your key successes on any expedition. So I flew to Kathmandu. That's where the first thing went wrong. We got to Kathmandu, and the airline explained that due to the lack of fuel in Kathmandu, they'd unloaded everybody's baggage in Delhi and left it behind. The logic behind this was that there was a shortage of fuel, so they couldn't refuel the aircraft in Kathmandu. So they had to have sufficient fuel to get back from Kathmandu, which meant they didn't have enough fuel to carry any luggage with them, which was kind of inconvenient for most of the passengers. And it meant I had to spend the entire day stressfully waiting in the airport, waiting for this baggage that might appear on a later flight at some point if we're lucky, but it may not. So the rest of the team went off to sort out permits and organise food and things like that. I just sat in the airport for about 8 hours, and then reached kind of a moment of despair, and then suddenly my baggage appeared on the conveyor, and step one was completed. So the guys came to collect me. They then announced that there was insufficient fuel for the minibus to drive us to Nepal, where we had to get the flight. So then we had to go down the black market and flash some dollars and buy some black market fuel to give to the minibus driver to then drive us on the rest of the journey to the airport. That was going to be an overnight drive, which was okay, until in the middle of the night we got involved in quite a big road crash. Several cars in front of us, somebody ran over a pedestrian and killed them. The police came to take over the situation, and then they blocked the road, but a lorry was driving too fast, and it kind of tried to drive around them, went up a bank, tipped over, and then crushed the two policemen under the lorry. So then we had to wait most of the night for these to be rescued, and then clear the road, and then we managed to drive. I think in the end we were driving about 18 hours to get to Nepal, just in time to meet our flight to fly us up into the mountain in Simikot. And the plane actually made it. We were quite lucky there, to be honest, because actually the plane crashed the following week and killed everybody on board. So if you look at the numbers, it's actually the same plane that we were on. N9 is the plane we were flying into Simikot. So that crashed the following day, so we were quite lucky. So we were now in the mountains. So it was just a case of kind of getting ourselves to the mountain and give it a go. So from Simikot, it's about a 4-day walk to Gavding, and I have to say this part of Nepal is just staggeringly beautiful and genuinely unspoiled. For example, it was a 4-day walk to our base camp, and we passed the last village on the first day. So then we had 3 days walking beyond the village, and we didn't see a single herdsman, no settlements, no villages. It was just a genuinely wild place. And I just can't recommend it enough. For trekking or climbing, the far west of Nepal is an amazing place. We can now see the team. We got myself and Mick Fowler on the left-hand side, and then we got Steve Burns and Ian Cartwright on the right-hand side. This was our expedition team. We've now reached what was going to turn out to be base camp. Unfortunately, the mules that we had couldn't actually make it to where we wanted to have base camp because of some moraines that were unsuitable for the mules. So they actually dropped us off short of where we planned to be. And actually they dropped us off at a point where we couldn't see the mountain. So it was a really weird sensation being abandoned by the mulemen in a base camp location to climb a mountain that we'd never seen, that we had no photos of. And even when we were left there, we still hadn't seen the mountain or worked out whether it was climbable or anything at all. So we had a really quite tense evening and night in base camp, waiting for our kind of reconnaissance in the morning to actually see whether, we knew the mountain was there, but was there actually a route to climb, or was it kind of feasible, or was it just just going to be an unsafe thing to try? But luckily, the following day we hiked up the valley and we found a pretty impressive mountain. This is the north buttress of Gavding. So Gavding is about I think it's about 6,200 meters high. I can't really remember, to be honest. And it was completely unclimbed. And we were sort of sat under the north buttress here, and we had to work out some way of actually climbing this mountain. Obviously, you can't just leap onto it straight away, so you need to do a bit of acclimatization. And the acclimatization really was an excuse to get up into the mountains and observe this mountain from different directions, different angles, trying to work out some kind of route we could follow. So what we have here actually is are the mountains of this area. So Gavding is the obvious lump on the right-hand side, but actually the highest peak in this area is the white peak on the left-hand side, which is a peak called Lachar Machuli. And that is actually on the permitted list. So what we claimed we were going to do is actually a traverse of the range finishing on Lachar Machuli. Clearly, we were never going to make the full traverse, but we actually had but that was the general plan. So sometimes when you want to climb these peaks, you need to think a bit laterally about how you're going to get a permit, and sometimes you need to be a bit creative. Otherwise, you'll not get anywhere, to be honest. So we spent a long time studying this face, and what I always do on these expeditions is I essentially draw a topo of the objective before we start, because the problem with mountains like this is once you get on it, it's so steep, it's almost impossible to see where you're going to go. So I usually spend several days with binoculars just studying the mountain, trying to identify a route up it. And then, although the mountain was huge, once we started to study it, you suddenly realised that the potential routes were actually kind of limited, because a combination of things like seracs threatening both sides, and then blank walls and overhangs and things like that, meant that there was actually a relatively limited potential to get up this thing. And we eventually kind of linked together a possible line. But actually, we realized that the line we'd identified was pretty much the only one we could possibly climb. Everything else had either blank sections or were overhanging or threatened by seracs. So we had a line, but we realized that there was no kind of plan B. If this route didn't go, there was going to be no way of sneaking round looking for an easier alternative. So so it looked like an exciting possible route, but we had no idea at all whether we could actually climb it. So back down to base camp, have a good feed up, have a rest, and then we essentially set off to do the route. Obviously, we're climbing in Alpine style, so everything has got to go on our backs. With these objectives, usually kind of set off with a week's food and fuel on our backs, and basically follow our noses. This is a picture of us in our bivouac just below the route, and actually, this is kind of my favourite point on any expedition. To be honest, is sat there in your bivy tent under the route. I just find it a really exciting, but also really kind of relaxing point on an expedition. Is you've got everything to go for. You've done your acclimatization. You've got yourself to the mountain. You've overcome all those kind of difficulties, and now all you've got to do is climb the route, and that's the fun part of it. So I always find that bivvy below the route a real high point of the expedition. It's something I really like. I remember when I was a young person in the Alps, you'd be bivvying under route, absolutely crapping yourself because you thought you might die the following day. But now I just find that the bivvy under a new route, just a wonderful experience. It's like the feeling that there's so much potential to be done. It's a real high point on any trip. So on the route, we kicked off, and to be honest, it got fairly technical right from the start. And actually on the low parts of the route, there was a lot of powder snow, and it was a bit nerve-wracking because it's really quite hard to climb powder snow on top of rock. And there was a whole day of wading up the lower part of the route, up to a kind of a classic bivvy just perched on a col. And so far the snow conditions have been terrible, and we just thought that this really probably wasn't going to work out, and the hoped for perfect ice higher on the route just wasn't going to be there. Looking up, because of the foreshortening, you can never see ice or snow when you look up a steep face. So it just looked like it was never going to go. It looked like a sort of a big alpine rock wall with no snow and ice. So I must admit, at the start of this route, I was a bit skeptical that things were just not going to work out. But then slowly, as we started to gain height, the snow and the ice improved, and we were just incredibly lucky. It turned out that all the sort of powder snow low down just turned into perfect polystyrene type neve. And every axe swing was a perfect placement, and there was just blobs of ice all the way up the mountain. Never continuous gullies, so there was no kind of like ice falls or gully type things. It was just simply blobs of perfect snow ice stuck to ledges all the way up. And actually in this picture, you can see where we were just camped the night before on that lovely little col. And it was steep, to be honest. There's quite a lot of hard climbing, and quite a few pitches where we just couldn't climb with a rucksack on, and we had to haul it up afterwards. And it was very time consuming, took a long time. Some days you could only climb like 3 or 4 pitches because it just took so long. But it was all quality. The rock was excellent, and the snow was excellent. Camping was actually pretty good as well. I've had some fairly horrific bivvies in my climbing career, and I think on this route we actually managed to lie down every night, or nearly lie down every night. And actually most nights the tent almost fitted onto the ledge, so it was pretty good really. I've got no complaints about the quality of the sleeping out. But it was steep, it has to be said. There was a lot of steep climbing and a lot of steep climbing is one word for it. I suppose panting and wheezing and struggling and wondering why on earth do we keep trying to do this. But it's strangely addictive, yes. After we'd been on the route for about 4 days, we had our one bout of bad weather. You can see the storm coming in. We're not too far below the summit, but a big storm came. Interestingly, you would imagine storms would come from the south, from sort of the Indian Ocean area, but this storm came over the Tibetan plateau, which was not what we expected. And it dropped about half a metre of snow on us, and made for some quite sort of scary avalanche conditions on the final slopes up towards the summit. The storm also brought a change in the weather, and it was almost like winter arrived overnight. And the final few days on the mountain were the coldest I've ever experienced in the Himalaya. You know, I know we were only at 6,000 meters, but it was far colder than anything I've experienced anywhere else. Really quite hard weather for moving in. And then we got to the top. So clearly we're on the summit now of Gavding. So I say unclimbed peak. I mean, to be honest, for me, it almost kind of represented everything that I kind of want in mountaineering. It was a massive adventure. But more than that, it was an unclimbed summit, and an unclimbed summit that we climbed by almost from one of its hardest routes. So it was almost like to make the first ascent of a mountain by a hard route always feels to me more respectful than just sneaking up the easy way around the back. So I felt we kind of gave the mountain the respect it deserved, and in return it allowed us to climb it. So that's a picture of me and Mick on the top. That's the route we climbed. You can see the sort of bivvies marked on there. I think, how many days was it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bivvies. We got to the top and it was so nice. We had a day off actually, so we stayed on the top for a day, looking at the view, and then we descended down the back. And I think it was I remember we had 29 Abolakov anchors to descend off the back of the mountain. So it was a really good descent down the back. And that's a picture of me and Mick at the bottom. It was quite a special thing for us, to be honest, because prior to this trip, we'd agreed that this was the last expedition we were going to do together. We still climb now. Don't get the wrong impression. We still climb together a lot. In fact, I was rock climbing with him last week. But we decided this was the last expedition we're going to do together, mainly because of the age difference. I was looking at trying some higher things, and Mick was definitely not interested in bigger things. So we agreed this would be the last trip we'd do together. And it was just wonderful that the last trip we did together was such a fine mountain and such a fine summit. So that was our ascent of Gavding. So I will stop there, and I will hand over back to Nick, if that's okay, Nick.
Thanks, Paul. Fantastic. I'm so glad your luggage arrived. Okay, folks. So wonderful. Finally tonight, we're joined by Rebecca Coles. Becky is a mountaineering and climbing instructor and expedition leader based in North Wales. She's climbed extensively throughout the Greater Ranges and the Alps, and in the autumn of 2016, very soon after that, after a tip-off from Mick Fowler about another beautiful unclimbed peak close to where he and Paul had just been, she and her partner Simon Verspeek also headed to the Humla region. Over to you, Becky.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was 2016 when Simon and I were thinking about going on another trip, and we wanted to possibly, definitely go to the Greater Ranges, and we were really interested in heading back to Nepal. We'd heard that the far west of Nepal had loads of great opportunities for first ascent. So I started to research there. I sort of got kind of a bit lost in the research, and I didn't really find anything that was an inspiring line or a really inspiring peak. And it kind of fell by the wayside a bit. And that was until I bumped into Mick Fowler at their Keswick Mountain Festival, and we were chatting that evening. And I said, "Oh, you're speaking here about Gavding, that's in the far western Nepal. I wondered if you'd seen any other peaks in the area that looked interesting." And he said, "Well, actually, there was a peak that we saw when we trekked in. If you give us your email, I'll send you a photo and a map of where it is." And so he sent me this picture of this peak. And immediately when I saw it, I thought, wow, that's a really incredible peak. And it's also not only really inspiring, and I wanted to go and climb it, but it looked like it was potentially within our sort of abilities as well, the sort of thing we were looking at. So the summer sort of ticked on, and work took over a bit. and we didn't get around to doing much planning, but there's always this nagging and this image of this peak. And so it came to the beginning of the autumn, and we thought, right, well, we need to make a decision on this. Are we going to go, or aren't we? Are we going to organise this, book flights? And so 6 weeks before going, we booked flights, and we started kind of the planning in earnest. We managed to hit a few grant deadlines, and then towards the end of October, we headed out to Nepal. Now, as Paul has kind of mentioned in his trip out to Simicot, exploratory mountaineering expeditions usually have logistical hiccups, and I've certainly had a lot of that in the past. But on this occasion, all our logistics went incredibly smoothly, and we had no hiccups at all, and arrived out in Simicot very easily, and got someone with some mules, and packed up and headed up and walked in the same route as Paul would have walked in to Gabding. And yeah, really incredible. We were there sort of in the autumn, and the autumn colours of the trees along the gorge were stunning. It's well travelled, this route, by locals who go up to trade in Tibet. So things like this really beautiful cantilever bridge is maintained for their travel, and some of the trails up here as well. And generally in the area, they're using mules rather than porters. And so we did the same. We had a guy with two mules help us get into a base camp. And going up the main valley, we rounded the corner after about 3 days trekking, and I looked up the tributary valley, and there was the peak that Mick had told us about. And it's always like a gush of obviously excitement, but also I'm always surprised that, oh, it's actually there, having only seen one picture of it before, and kind of scoped it out on Google Earth. But yeah, it's brilliant to finally see where you're heading. This was the final camp with the mules, before we then went up this valley here to put in a base camp, another kind of half day's walk away. And we're next to a little building here, which the yak herders do come up in here to graze the yaks, but not at this time of the year, so we didn't see anyone up there. Trekking in close to the mountain, we're looking directly at the east ridge that's coming down towards us of the mountain there, that I'll talk a little about later. So we settled into base camp, and this gave us then the opportunity to start acclimatizing and start finding a route up onto the glacier as well. I'm sort of ever conscious with the glaciers receding that actually this can be quite a tricky part of a trip, to negotiate any moraines and to get onto the glacier itself. But in this case, again, we were struck lucky, and actually it was very straightforward to get onto the glacier, and we didn't have any difficulties there. We did move camp up towards next to the glacier, and we're on the north side of the mountain here, and we did find actually incredibly cold throughout the whole trip. I think it's one of the coldest trips I'd actually done before. Yeah, and certainly Simon there mostly talked about where our next holiday was going to be, and it was definitely going to be in Greece and going to Klimnos or something. It was very cold. So at this point, at this camp, actually, we had a bit of a disappointment in that we got into here and we saw evidence of another expedition. So there'd been like tent platforms built, and as we worked our way onto the glacier, we found sort of some fixed ropes about on the glacier on what we thought was actually quite benign terrain. So there'd obviously been another trip here. We had thought from our research that we were going into sort of an unexplored mountain, and we didn't know about this expedition at all. And here actually where we're camped, it was quite eerie because actually around the rocks here were loads of guy lines, and they'd all been cut. So that felt quite eerie that all the tent guy lines had been cut and left behind. But I'm guessing what had happened was that there'd been a big a snowfall event when they were there, and their guy lines maybe froze in place, and they had to pack up the tents and they just cut them. So we were quite disappointed that other people had been there. However, as we went further up the mountain, the fixed ropes disappeared, and later on, when we were much higher on the mountain, on the more technical sections, we didn't find any evidence of them. So we don't think they did probably go much higher, and then sort of halfway up the glacier. So this is kind of where the tent and the camp was, and we're looking sort of straight up the northeast face here, which is quite foreshortened in this picture, but you can see all the seracs and around there, so that's obviously not an option to go up. There's a ridge to the north that's on the right hand side, and then on the left is the east ridge that we were looking towards as we were trekking in to our base camp. And that's where we chose to go up. So we set off and going further up the glacier, the fixed ropes were evident to begin with, but then they disappeared. And it was kind of strange because the fixed ropes were on this sort of terrain. And although this crevasse looks quite dramatic, actually, in general, the crevasses weren't that bad at all. But what we did find as we went up was incredibly unconsolidated snow. And it was quite unique, really, because there just didn't seem to be any advantage to going second compared to breaking trail. You just seem to sink in exactly the same amount, and it was just two of us, so really exhausting, energy sapping, and very slow going. And I wondered if this snow was because of the very cold temperatures they were experiencing this autumn, and that's why the snow was so kind of bottomless and unconsolidated. We'd hoped to reach the col to put a camp in, that's sort of above and left of me in the picture there. But that day we were much slower. So we were putting a camp quite far below the col. And this meant that we were running out of time. We needed to get to the summit by the next day. To be able to kind of meet the guy with the mules that was going to come in and get us at the right time a few days later. So the time pressure was on, and the next morning we kind of swam up through this snow to the col and didn't get there until after dawn to get onto the East Ridge. But thankfully there, the snow really improved. Although it's still harder going than we would have liked, it did really improve on the ridge. So we could climb up this ridge. And here we are on the ridge looking east now. And this just over to the left of Simon's shoulder is Gavding here. And as we continued up the ridge, there was a few pitches of climbing, but mainly kind of moving rope together on the ridge, and all the while looking back to the east and looking back at Gavding there, and the face that Mick and Paul had climbed the previous year. The ridge narrowed quite a lot towards the top, became quite exposed, and then brought us up here to the summit. And as I said, on the sections of pitch climbing, we hadn't seen any evidence of other expeditions. So we thought that this could possibly be a first ascent here. We had pretty much really stable weather, apart from a couple of days of wind early on in acclimatization, but this weather that we had was throughout the whole 2 weeks whilst we were in base camp. This is from the summit looking north into Tibet here, and you can just see Kailash popping out here, and some people do come to Simacot and trek into Kailash from Simacot. So it being quite a long day, it was quite late in the day now, descending back down the same route, all the while looking back towards Gavding, and we're back getting towards the Col here, but our camp's like way back down below us. And out of sight in this picture. So we still had quite a long way to go. And yeah, we summited just on the kind of our last possible day, really, so that we could get back down and get back into base camp. And the next day we were met by the mules and could pack up our bags and walk out. And as we were walking out there, we were looking back up the valley and back into the East Ridge, going up to the summit, which we'd climbed a few days previous. So all in all, our experience of the far west of Nepal was absolutely fantastic, and we'd had a wonderful trip there, done some really enjoyable climbing, which was exactly what we hoped for, challenging for us but achievable. We still don't know who had been there previously, and we don't know for sure whether they did get to the summit or not, but we'd had a wonderful trip ourselves, and were blessed with good weather and straightforward logistics on that occasion. So thanks everyone for listening this evening, and I'll now hand back to Nick.
Thanks, Becky. Fantastic. It really looks like an incredible area. So folks, if you have a question now for Paul, Henry or Becky, do raise a hand or type your questions into the chat on Zoom or YouTube, and I'll read them out. And while we're waiting for those to come in, don't forget you can catch up on all our previous Alpine Clubcasts on the Alpine Club Library YouTube page. So let's just have a look to see if we have any questions coming in. So I think I'll kick off with a question first of all. Perhaps we'll start with Henry. We'll go in order. Henry, yeah, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what Kathmandu was like back in the 60s.
Well, it was obviously very much less developed. And the main thing was there was only one place you could stay, and that was in the famous Royal Hotel that was created by an ex-Russian ballet dancer called Boris Lisanovich. And you had to be Boris's friend, otherwise you're sort of sleeping in the streets. And through him, you got all sorts of introductions to strange people. But the most amazing thing was that, of course, I needed some kind of a permit to do something. And Jimmy Roberts had suggested this trip to the west part of Nepal. And so I went to there's an old Rana palace called the Singhadobar, which half of it had burnt down, but this is where the whole of the Nepalese government was established. And I managed to find the right guy, and he gave me a permit to go anywhere in West Nepal, which means west of the, I guess, the Kali Gandaki, anywhere west of Nepal for 6 months. So it was the most amazing opportunity. I kicked myself that I'd left the Libyan oil fields for 1 month, and I really had to go back to my work. But technically, I had a piece of paper where I could go wherever I wanted in West Nepal for 6 months and climbing whatever mountains I came across. And I always, so that's a huge regret in my life. I should have quit my job and just wandered around West Nepal for 6 months.
Thanks, Henry. There's a question came in from Andy Dennis. He was asking about, what time of year to go. I see, Paul, you've written October is when you went. October, November. Paul, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always gone in for October to Nepal. I know people do climb in November. I find November gets a bit cold. So it might be okay. November's okay for peaks that you kind of maybe walking up, but if you're involved in technical climbing, I think November gets quite harsh. If you're standing around lots and you're trying to use your hands, I think November is quite cold. So I would always stick with October personally.
Okay, Paul. Yeah, while you're there, maybe you could tell us a bit more about Mick Fowler. What's Mick really like? I can see, by the way, he's not in this meeting, so
I can say what I like. So Mick he's a legend, isn't he? So it's like climbing with a legend. I remember I went to when I was 16 and I just started climbing. I remember going to a lecture at Leeds University by this bloke I'd never heard of called Mick Fowler, and watching all these pictures of him climbing in Scotland and Peru and places like that. So it was always amazing years later to end up climbing with him. But he's probably the most positive person I've ever met in my life. He's so positive about everything. Nothing ever seems to be a problem, and everything can be overcome. And that's wonderful. Though it has to be said, after a month, it really does piss you off, and you just want him to be miserable for a while. So I think I once said to somebody, Mick's greatest strength is his positivity, and the thing that's most annoying about him is his positivity. So I think that's the best way of summing him up.
Thank you. I was just looking for to remind myself. He did a ClubCast and talked about climbing chalk routes in the UK. I do recommend that for people to look that up, because it's great, and his positivity is perhaps the first thing that strikes you when he speaks. It's wonderful. There's a question for Henry. It's come in from Daniel. Colin Thuban wrote of his trek from Simicot to Mount Kailash. Would it be possible to do that now, or at least post-COVID?
Well, the two ways of getting to Mount Kailash, if you're a Westerner, are through Simicot, and then you trek for, I don't know, a week to the border, and then you're taken in Chinese vehicles to Mount Kailash, and then you circumnavigate it with everybody else, or you go from Lhasa and you just drive to Mount Kailash. Actually, my brother's done it, and many people do it. And I'm sure Paul and Becky saw groups of people doing this when they arrived at Simicot. And I'm sure it's still possible, unless the Chinese have clamped down on access to Mount Kailash. But for the Indians, the main access is up the Kali River on the Indian side, which is the far west of Nepal, so where Nepal meets India. So you drive up the Indian side of the Kali River, and then you cross over a col called the, I can't honestly remember the name of it, but the Indians grabbed a piece of territory. There's a big territorial dispute between Nepal and India controlling the access of Kailash. But I think via Simikot, it's still very possible, post-COVID, obviously.
Okay, Henry, thanks. There are a few coming on YouTube. I'll go to that after this one. Susan, yes, Susan asks, Becky, did you spot any other enticing peaks on your way in or out? Certainly looked like it from the photos.
There's loads in the area. I think it's just, I don't know the full history on whether they're climbed or not. I mean, you're welcome to my photos, and then you can start researching. But it's a great area for sure.
I mean, Paul, the Api and Saipal areas look huge, and they can't have been visited very much. There must be some fantastic climbs there.
I do have a plan, but I'm not going to tell anybody now. Yes, but no, there's definitely a plan for something in that area.
Right, good.
And Julian Atwood, Freeman Atwood, goes there really regularly, and he's very knowledgeable about the area. So
Yeah,
he's one person to tap his knowledge if he wants to give any.
There's a great article by Julian in the Alpine Journal 2019, which I'm holding up, all about Western Nepal. So I recommend that for your research if you're thinking of finding peaks. A few more before I go to Nigel. Rosalind's written in. Thank you for inspiring and entertaining talks about a little-known part of Nepal. Hopefully others will be encouraged to follow suit. So should we go to you, Nigel? There are some questions coming on YouTube, so go ahead.
Yeah, we've got a couple of people asking questions here. Tom Harding says, thanks for the talks. And he says he's part of a team who were planning to climb south of Gavding at the end of last year, but COVID cancelled that. And he just wanted to say thanks to Paul for answering questions. And he wants to know what people think of the likelihood of climbing in October in Nepal this year.
I would say it's
for everyone, really.
I think it's very hard to make that call. I am planning to go in October this year, but I'm struggling to predict how viable that is. But I do know that speaking to friends in Nepal, a lot of people are actually receiving the vaccine over there. I think we often we sort of sit in Britain and think we're doing really well, and then Europe's doing really badly. But then I was speaking to people in Nepal, and loads of people there are getting the vaccine. So because they're so reliant on tourism for an income, I think there is a reasonable chance that they will be open again. Maybe you might require a vaccine passport, but I'm hopeful, and Nepal needs it. I think their 90% of their income is from tourism, so they are suffering really, really badly. So especially following on a few years after the earthquake, etc. So hopefully it will happen, but I wouldn't like to place a bet on that.
Did you see there was I saw in the news that I think it was a Bahraini Everest expedition who was trying to put the first Bahraini on top of Everest, but they were taking with them enough vaccine to vaccinate any Nepalese they found en route.
Wow.
And when the Nepalese government found out about this, they kicked up a fuss because they wanted to control the vaccination. So there's all sorts of strange things going on.
Any more, Nigel? From YouTube?
Got one more question from Alison Cameron. So Alison and her husband were on a trek to Everest Base Camp in April 2015 and left just days before the earthquake. And she asks, were any of you there then, or have you been since? And what do you think's changed in relation to trekking and climbing?
I can answer that. I was actually there when I was at Kumjung village, which is just above Namche Bazaar when the earthquake happened. And then I never used Lukla, so we were walking in from either Salieri or Jiri 2 years later, and there was still terrible damage, and the rebuilding hadn't really started, and it was a mess actually. They've got a huge amount of aid that is only trickling into the villages, so it was pretty bad even 2 years later.
I would say I went the year after the earthquake to West Nepal, and there was no evidence at all there'd been an earthquake. So I think it varies a huge amount depending on where you're going. Yeah. But in West Nepal, I don't think they experienced any earthquake at all. Really, not worth talking about. So there was no evidence of any earthquake, and the locals, it wasn't referred to or anything like that. So I think it varies a huge amount from area to area. Yeah. And then I was in Nepal in 2019 in the Khumbu, and again there was no evidence of any earthquake damage. Everything had been repaired, etc. So I think at the time it varied between regions, and then now I think in the sort of tourist destinations they seem to have pretty much repaired everything that I could see.
Yeah, that was a feeling I got when in the west of Nepal, that it hadn't been affected at all. And speaking to people that were out there during the earthquake, certainly trips that were in the Dhaulagiri area, they weren't even aware an earthquake had happened, and their sort of agents were trying to get hold of them to see whether they were okay, and they were fine, and they weren't aware it happened. So it was more, yeah, the Langtang area and towards the Khumbu that was, and Kathmandu and stuff. That was.
I tell you, if you were standing on the ground when it happened, it was unbelievable.
In that region, yeah. But the west that we're talking about was
Although the epicenter was Gurkha land in the west, the central west.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to unmute Nick Simons, Nick Fletcher, who's going to ask a question. Yeah, Nick? Nick, are you unmuted? Sorry.
I think you managed to mute me again. Sorry. Thanks, all three of you. It's so inspiring and fascinating. Thank you. I've actually got two questions. Firstly, Becky, can you tell us if you're an October person as well, and what your specific dates were?
So we went toward end of October, really into November, and we experienced really cold conditions. And I've been going out towards November really, because October's still, I'm a freelance outdoor instructor, so October's still quite a good month for me to be working, and November it starts to get quiet for work. So that's what steers my decision really with getting away.
Yeah, you definitely emphasised the cold, didn't you, in your talk?
Yeah, I think it was one of the coldest trips we've done.
My other question is for Henry. It's going to sound silly, but I really want to know, you had a picture of John Tyson on the Aiguille de Tournois with a cat. What's the story with the cat?
Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. So the cat belonged to the
The drums are rolling. I'm afraid I can't fill in the gaps there. We don't know who the cat belonged to. We'll see if we can get Henry back. Meanwhile, Henry's on pause. So we go to Daniel. Danny has a comment on the Gorka earthquake. Danny, are you able to unmute yourself?
I think I am unmuted now. I hope so anyway. In autumn 2019, myself and William Newsom and a group of others did a trek round Mount Manaslu, and we went through the Gorka village, which was the epicenter of the 2015 earthquake. And it was obvious that a vast amount of damage had occurred. But at that time, 4 years afterwards, a great deal of reconstruction had taken place. And the village seemed to be, like so many Nepalese villages, in a rather sort of chaotic way, extremely busy and active and operational. And then further on the trek, we saw evidence of, which I think you probably all know, how buildings that had heavy slate roofs had collapsed in, so that most of those who died in the earthquake died who were in buildings as a result of the collapse of roofs. So they're using corrugated iron now, normally blue corrugated iron. And so the villages were completely dominated by these blue roofed houses. But we found that the villages on the Manaslu trek were all back to normal and extremely active from a trekking point of view. Rather hoping that they'll be back like that this autumn.
Okay, thanks, Danny.
Sorry, Nick, I didn't finish. My internet went funny.
Yes, so we lost you just literally as you're about to say where the cat.
Yeah. So if you didn't spot the cat in time, you had to take it with you on the climb. And so we put the cat on top of Tyson's rucksack. And the Tour Noir is a sort of easy rock climbing for beginners, but I mean, it's still a rock climb. And the cat stayed with us, and we took it back all the way down to the refuge. And the next day we were heading out, but crossing over into Switzerland. And we had to make damn sure that we didn't have the cat behind us again. So the cat was well known for, having a free ride. It was a very adventurous cat. The key thing is getting it back to the refuge alive.
Brilliant, thanks, Henry. Becky, I was quite interested to see that, your kind of reaction to the, evidence of another expedition. I've done a bit of research now for expeditions. How often do you think this happens, that perhaps you go on a trip and then you find evidence where you perhaps thought, you were going to be the first? There must be plenty of...
I think it's really common, especially when there's complications with permits involved, and possibly people thinking or not knowing that they've not got the right permit, so they're not going to report it so much afterwards. The classic one, I guess, is Andy Cave on Layla Peak in Pakistan. They climbed that without a permit, and then I think some Italians paid for the permit afterwards, and climbed it thinking it was the first ascent, and then found, I think they left a gas canister with their name scratched in it at the top or something. So that must have been a bit disappointing to get all the way to the top. And I'm sure it happens all the time. I'm sure multiple peaks climbed for the first time on several occasions. But I think it's not really, it's not really about that for me. It's going to an amazing area, and we just had a fantastic time there. The initial feeling is a bit of disappointment, and then you think, well, hey, we're here, no one else is, the weather's good, the climbing looks good, so let's enjoy ourselves.
It certainly adds an element of detective work.
Yeah, and it's still a mystery, and I'm still quite intrigued to know who was there, and that that leaving that camp in such a hurry. I think there's a story behind that.
Absolutely. Let's go to Rosalind, shall we? Rosalind, do you want to have a word?
Yes, I was just going to go back and make a comment about the earthquake. In that, my husband and I have been to Kathmandu a lot, and prior to the earthquake, we'd actually been the previous 3 winters to Kathmandu from Kuwait. We got to know people there as well. And we went the December following the earthquake, and whereas people observed, obviously it was terribly sad what had happened in Kathmandu. We didn't try to go outside because of fuel shortages and so on, but places like Durbar Square obviously were badly damaged. Swayambhunath Monkey Temple, we went up there, and I mean it was still open. We thought sort of being tourists was probably one of the best things they could do, but it was really sad to observe the damage. And we did drive around with our driver some of the more damaged parts, and while there was a lot of volunteer work going on, there was also a sort of apathy on the part of some of the Nepalese locals, which we've been told about. Whether it was a sort of fatalism, I don't know, but that was some months later, and obviously not enough was getting done quickly enough. We had been fortunate to be able to take with us some donations of bedding and clothing, which we collected in Kuwait. We got an extra allowance from the airline, and this Wenson Friends, who their organisation, they literally kind of put things on their back and walk out to the villages where they're needed, so we know that they sort of got good homes. But it was very sad seeing and hearing about the very slow progress at that time that was being made. People who couldn't get insurance because they couldn't prove they owned their houses, even though the roof would fall in, and people who were kind of living in tents or not getting any compensation. And it was rather a sorry state of affairs. Obviously, I think it will have improved a lot since then. Added to which, the fuel embargo, everything was terribly cold. I mean, there was virtually no heating. You had to wear, coats and scarves and gloves to go out to dinner. It was actually warmer to go to an outdoor restaurant. Might have had a sort of central sort of fireplace in the courtyard. But it was just cold the whole time. And our boutique hotel has been work in progress, and the heating there was a bit hit and miss. The yogurt would be frozen at breakfast and so on. So, I mean, as a holiday, it was, well, I mean, that's not sort of why we went, but it was very sad to observe. And, I sort of encourage, I'm sure other people have, sort of try and get tourism back on track, and, visitors going there again. But, hopefully, as I said, things are a lot better now than they were in late 2015. Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment on that, Rosalind, because as far as the historic centers of Kathmandu, Patan, and so on are concerned, the last major earthquake was 1934. And in 1934, it was as bad as in 2015. And the temples, just to talk about temples rather than people's houses, they fell down in 1934, just like they did in 2015. But in 1934, the ruling class in Nepal were the Ranas, and they were tyrants, but they got things done, and they repaired without almost any foreign intervention or aid. They put those temples back together again, and they put their houses back together again, so that if you went to Kathmandu before 2015, that's what you saw. You saw the reconstruction of the temples done by the Rana dynasty. Now, the temples fell down again in 2015. And, if you visit Nepal every year, which is more or less what I do, one way or the other, you notice that the temples are not being rebuilt. And finally, although it's a World Heritage Site, the international community and the Nepalese government simply cannot get their act together to rebuild these temples. So finally, the people who are actually rebuilding the temples are the Chinese. So the Chinese it's one of the ways in which they're infiltrating the Nepalese society and so on. So if you look at the reconstruction of the temples, it's all Chinese financed, and you have these huge billboards that tell you what's going on in Chinese and in English. And that's another factor actually in West Nepal, in the areas that we've been talking about tonight. The Chinese are driving roads from Tibet south into Tibet to down the valleys in Nepal to join up with the Nepalese road system. And I believe it's even happening in Dolpo. So the dominant force in Nepal now is Chinese.
Thanks, Henry. I was actually going to ask a question about Tibetan influence, and you've just kind of answered that. But sorry, Rosalind, did you want to comment?
I was just saying thank you. That was interesting to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For the question. I'm just going to read out a comment from John Porter, actually. He says, knowing the culture of the places you are going to climb greatly adds to the experience when you get there. Back in the 70s, there were just a few academic books with little deep and appreciative historical background. But with the recent additions of Henry's Tales from the Himalaya and Ed Douglas's fantastic Himalaya, A Human History, modern climbers have the cultural equivalent of good weather forecasts in helping to make the most of the experience. Thanks, John, for that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to
John.
Looking forward to a signed copy of your book, Henry.
All right. Okay. Well, watch out for the pigeon.
I can't see any more questions coming in. I was going to ask Henry about permits. Did we cover that? I can't remember. I think you did.
I did. Yeah.
So unless there are any other more coming in, I can't see any more raised hands. Nigel, anything on YouTube?
No, nothing more on YouTube.
Okay, well, in that case, there's a comment from Tom Nakamura from the Japanese Alpine Club. He's been responsible for many, if not most of the Asian climbs getting reported in English. I know the library gets a copy and that there is a regular email version too. Have not used it for research, but it should be e-consulted. Well, that's interesting. Thanks for that. Oh, that's from Henry. Sorry. Yes, Henry Day. Good stuff. Well, I think we'll leave it there, folks. Do stick around afterwards for a chat, but I'll just tell you what we're going to do next. Firstly, thanks very much to Becky, Paul, and Henry. Fantastically entertaining evening and really inspiring. We've just got to get out to the Wild West. That's the last in our Easter ClubCast season, which has been really great fun to do. Please continue to send in any feedback. We're planning a new ClubCast series for June, and that includes a film never seen before about a traverse of the Patagonian ice cap in the 1950s, which Leo Dickinson sort of dug out for us. Then there's one about climbing the Alpine 3,000 metre peaks, and then also one to celebrate 1871, an amazing year for female alpinists in the Valais, and that year was the inspiration for this year's Women Rise Up meet, which celebrates the 150th centenary of that year. Do, of course, write in with any ideas for ClubCasts. We'd love to have feedback and ideas. Meanwhile, have a look at the Alpine Club Library YouTube page. You can subscribe to that for updates, and there you can watch, like, and share all the previous Alpine ClubCasts. If everyone could unmute yourselves now, that would be great. Thanks all for joining us. Keep safe. Please put your hands together for the speakers.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Henry. Wonderful. I think I recognise your voice there. So that's a still, that photograph you can see there is a still from a film by Luca Signorelli, who is an academic at the University of Adelaide. And Leo, as I said, Leo Dickinson told us about that film. So we're going to try and show that in June, which would be very cool. Yeah, so